Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's story is about a moment that changed everything, a time when celebration turned into silence and pride was met with a harsh dose of reality. The title says it all. Russians celebrated too early, then reality hit hard. What started as a victory full of joy and confidence soon became a story that no one saw coming. It all began when the Russian media declared a major win on the front lines. News outlets were filled with confident voices, waving flags, and triumphant headlines. Soldiers were being congratulated, songs were played on the streets, and people believed the war had taken a decisive turn in Russia's favor. The mood was electric. Social media exploded with videos of soldiers dancing, commanders boasting about their achievements, and supporters cheering the so-called success. For a moment, it seemed unstoppable. Russia was on top of the world. But what they didn't know was that the celebration had come far too early. The reality, harsh and undeniable, was waiting just around the corner. Reports began to emerge from the battlefield. The situation wasn't as victorious as claimed. What was thought to be a total win turned out to be a temporary advance, one that came at a heavy price. Ukrainian forces had not retreated in defeat. They had strategically regrouped. While the Russians were busy celebrating, Ukraine was quietly preparing a powerful counterattack. The following days turned the tables completely. Precision strikes began hitting critical Russian positions, supply lines were disrupted, communication broke down, and panic started spreading among the troops. Videos surfaced showing abandoned equipment, chaotic retreats, and confusion across the ranks. The same media that was once filled with celebration suddenly went silent. The tone shifted from confident to cautious. What was once pride now turned into disbelief. The celebration that had filled the streets began to fade as people started realizing the truth. Families who had danced in joy now waited anxiously for news about their loved ones on the front. The same commanders who had boasted of success now avoided the cameras. Reality had come crashing down, exposing the difference between propaganda and the actual situation on the ground. The images of destroyed tanks, burnt vehicles, and exhausted soldiers told a very different story, one that could no longer be hidden. As the days passed, the world watched closely. Analysts began to question how Russia could have celebrated so early. It became clear that the victory had been more of a psychological operation than a real military success. The early celebration had cost valuable time, morale, and credibility. The Ukrainian forces, backed by intelligence and precision technology, exploited that overconfidence perfectly. They struck at the right moment, hitting hard and fast, reclaiming lost ground before the Russians even realized what had happened. Inside Russia, the atmosphere shifted. Social media that once spread victory clips was now flooded with frustration. People began to ask tough questions. Why had they been told they were winning when the reality was far more complicated? Soldiers returning from the front lines began speaking out, describing chaos, lack of coordination, and misleading orders. The truth was breaking through the cracks, and it wasn't something the government could easily control anymore. On the ground, morale dropped. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline as losses grew. The very forces that had celebrated were now fighting for survival in brutal conditions. The psychological blow was immense. The soldiers who believed they had already won suddenly faced the terrifying reality that the battle had only just begun. And that realization cut deeper than any physical wound. Meanwhile, Ukraine's response was methodical and fierce. Their counterattacks were not just about reclaiming land. They were about sending a message. They wanted the world to see that they were not defeated, that they could fight back even when the odds seemed impossible. The footage of Ukrainian troops raising their flags over retaken areas became a symbol of resilience and strength. The contrast was undeniable. One side celebrated too early, the other stayed silent, planned carefully, and struck with precision. As the situation unfolded, the Russian public could no longer ignore what was happening. Sanctions tightened, losses mounted, and morale within the country began to crumble. That initial wave of celebration felt like a distant memory. What was once seen as proof of dominance now stood as an example of dangerous overconfidence. The same energy that had fueled pride now turned into frustration and sorrow. In the end, this moment became a lesson for both sides, and for the world watching. It showed how quickly the tide of war can turn, how dangerous it is to mistake propaganda for truth, and how easily pride can blind even the most powerful nations. Celebrating too early doesn't just weaken your strategy, it exposes your vulnerabilities. The Russians had danced to the rhythm of false victory, believing the war was theirs to command. But when reality struck, it hit harder than any missile or bullet. It shattered illusions, exposed weaknesses, and reminded everyone that in war, truth always finds its way to the surface. The soldiers who once smiled for the cameras now faced the harsh silence of reality. The cheers had turned into whispers, and the confidence into caution. The world watched, and the message was clear: never celebrate too early. Because in the moments when victory feels certain, that's when danger hides the deepest. What the Russians experienced was more than a military setback. It was a psychological collapse, a reminder that pride without proof can be the greatest enemy of all. So as history records this chapter, it will not be remembered for the brief celebration of victory, but for the hard lesson that followed. Russia celebrated too early, and when reality hit, it hit hard enough to shake their confidence, their strategy, and perhaps even their future in the conflict. And that, more than anything, is what makes this story unforgettable. The Russians celebrated too early, believing they had achieved a decisive victory that would change the course of the conflict in their favor. But what followed proved that premature pride can be more destructive than defeat itself. It began with confident announcements across state media, bold claims of a massive breakthrough on the front lines, and endless streams of triumphant videos showing soldiers cheering, waving flags, and chanting victory songs. The mood across the nation was euphoric. People believed they were witnessing a turning point that would bring glory and dominance. Military officials delivered speeches filled with certainty, declaring that the enemy had been crushed, and the streets were filled with joy and pride. It was a moment when confidence overshadowed caution and truth was lost behind the noise of celebration. But in the shadows of this joy, a different reality was unfolding, one that no one wanted to acknowledge. While Russia celebrated, Ukraine was silent, focused, and strategic. The calm before the storm was misread as defeat, and that was the first mistake. Intelligence reports, ignored by overconfident commanders, showed that Ukrainian forces were regrouping, not retreating. They were preparing something that would catch everyone off guard. The Russians, caught in their illusion of success, relaxed their defenses, stretched their supply lines, and believed they had already won. Then, within days, everything changed. When the counteroffensive began, it hit like a thunderstorm. Precision missiles struck ammunition depots, command centers, and vital logistics routes. Russian troops who had been celebrating one moment found themselves cut off the next. Communications went dark, supplies ran short, and panic spread through the ranks. Videos that once showed laughter and victory now showed confusion and chaos. The same soldiers who had danced for the cameras were now running for cover, unsure of where the next strike would come from. The silence from the Kremlin grew louder with every passing hour as the truth became impossible to hide. The shift was brutal and fast. What was once painted as a victory turned into a desperate attempt to maintain control. Cities that were claimed to be secured suddenly became battlefields again. Entire units disappeared under relentless counterattacks. The celebration that had echoed across Russia now turned into disbelief and denial. Families who had proudly shared the news of victory were now terrified, searching for information about missing soldiers. Mothers who had smiled days earlier were now crying in silence, waiting for calls that never came. Inside Russia, the cracks began to show. Social media, once filled with patriotic music and victory slogans, turned into a storm of frustration and anger. People began to ask questions that the government didn't want to answer. How could they have been told the war was going well when losses were mounting so rapidly? Where was the leadership that had promised an easy win? The propaganda machine that once seemed unstoppable was suddenly overwhelmed by the harsh weight of truth. Even loyal supporters began to doubt what they were hearing. The illusion of control was gone. On the battlefield, morale collapsed. Commanders issued desperate orders, but confusion ruled the ground. Soldiers reported being sent into impossible situations with no clear objectives and no backup. The overconfidence that had defined their earlier moves now became their greatest weakness. Ukrainian forces took advantage of every mistake, every gap, every sign of disorganization. Their strikes were surgical and relentless, reclaiming territory piece by piece, turning Russian strongholds into traps. The psychological blow was immense, not just for the troops, but for the entire nation that had celebrated a hollow victory. Internationally, the world watched the shift in disbelief. Analysts who had questioned Russia's early declarations were now proven right. The story became clear. It wasn't just a tactical mistake. It was a failure of perception, pride, and propaganda. Celebrating too early had blinded Russia to the realities of modern warfare. Technology, intelligence, and strategy had replaced brute force, and Ukraine had mastered all three. The Russian leadership, confident in old methods and outdated assumptions, found themselves facing an enemy far more prepared and resilient than they had imagined. The economic and social impact was just as severe. Sanctions continued to squeeze the Russian economy, and the cost of war grew heavier with each passing day. What had been sold to the public as a quick campaign now looked like a draining, endless struggle. The people's faith began to crack. Trust in leadership weakened, and the patriotic spirit that once fueled the nation's pride turned into quiet resentment. Behind closed doors, even the most loyal voices began to whisper doubts. The early celebrations had not only failed to inspire lasting confidence, they had exposed the fragility of it. The emotional fallout was deeper than anyone had expected. Soldiers returning from the front spoke not of victory, but of exhaustion, fear, and disillusionment. Many felt betrayed, realizing that the truth had been hidden from them. They had been told they were fighting for glory, but what they found was chaos and loss. The images of burnt vehicles, destroyed villages, and lost comrades haunted them more than any speech could heal. The gap between what they were promised and what they experienced was too wide to ignore, and through it all, Ukraine's resilience became a symbol of determination. Their silent endurance, their ability to take a hit and return stronger, became the contrast that exposed Russia's overconfidence. They didn't celebrate early, they waited, planned, and struck when it mattered most. Their patience became their power, and their precision became their advantage. While Russia celebrated illusions, Ukraine built strategy. When the moment came, it wasn't a battle of weapons, it was a battle of minds. In the end, the lesson was undeniable. The Russians had celebrated too early, and reality hit them harder than any missile or artillery strike ever could. It shattered pride, dismantled trust, and left scars that no propaganda could hide. The world saw the truth behind the noise, that arrogance can turn victories into defeats, and that in war, the only celebration worth having is the one earned by truth, not illusion. This moment will be remembered not for the false victory that sparked it, but for the painful reality that followed. It will stand as a reminder to nations and leaders alike. Never mistake temporary advantage for total success. Never let pride speak louder than reason. Because when you celebrate too soon, you open the door for reality to hit. And when it does, it hits hard enough to rewrite everything you thought you knew.